In February of 1836, roughly 200 men were sealed inside a crumbling Spanish mission on the edge of San Antonio de Bizar, and they were running out of time. The Mexican army under General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna had surrounded the compound on all sides. There would be no resupply. There would be no relief column arriving in time. What those men ate during those 13 days between February 23rd and March 6th was not chosen from a menu. It was scraped from storerooms, coaxed from smoky fires, stretched across mouths that grew quieter with each passing night. Number 11 on this list was the food that Mexican soldados themselves had eaten on their march north. Number 4 was so common in Texas settlements that families kept it in leather pouches stitched to their belts. Number 18 contains an ingredient frontier. Surgeons valued more for medicine than for cooking. These 25 foods were not the stuff of legend. They were the stuff of survival. Hit that subscribe button and let us count down the 25 foods actually eaten at the Alamo during its final 13 days. Number 25, parched corn. Before the siege began in earnest, the defenders had received provisions from Gonzales and from sympathetic Tejano families in the surrounding town. Among those provisions was parched corn, field corn, that had been dried and roasted over low heat until the kernels hardened into something that could survive months in a saddlebag without rotting. Parched corn was the travel food of the Texas frontier in 1836. Comanche raiders carried it. Anglo settlers carried it. Mexican soldiers on long marches carried it. You could chew it raw, grind it rough between two stones, and mix it with water into a paste, or drop it into boiling water for a thin porridge that cost almost nothing to make. For the defenders at the Alamo, parched corn sitting in storeroom sacks was exactly the insurance a besieged garrison needed. Number 24, salt pork. The Alamo's storeroom inventories, partially reconstructed from supply records and contemporary accounts, confirmed that salt pork was present inside the compound before Santa Anna's forces closed the ring. Slabs of fatty pork belly packed in coarse salt inside wooden barrels could survive 6 months in moderate temperatures. February in San Antonio was cool enough that the barrels sitting in the mission storeroom kept well through the siege. The cooks serving the garrison sliced it thick and fried it in iron pans, rendering the salt down into the fat and producing a grease that could flavor a dozen other dishes. When firewood or time ran short, salt pork eaten cold off the rind with hardtack was enough to get a man through a watch. Number 23, dried beef, carne seca. The Tejano families who had lived in and around San Antonio for generations knew how to preserve beef in ways Anglo settlers from the American South were still learning. Carne seca was beef sliced into long, thin strips, salted heavily, rubbed sometimes with dried chili and garlic, and hung in the sun and wind to dry until the strips turned dark and leathery. Properly dried, it could last for months. It was dense with protein and salt and could be eaten straight off the strip without any preparation. In the storerooms of a mission that had been a Spanish and then Mexican military garrison for decades before the Texas Revolution, dried beef in some form was almost certainly present. Number 22, cornmeal. The grinding stone found in the Alamo compound was not decorative. Corn in various forms was the caloric foundation of Texas frontier life in 1836. And cornmeal ground from dried field corn was one of the most durable and versatile staples a garrison could hold. Mixed with water and salt, cornmeal became corn dodgers, dense flat cakes pressed by hand and baked on a flat rock or in a dry skillet. Mixed looser, it became a porridge that fed men who were too cold or too exhausted to chew. The Tejano civilians sheltering inside the compound were experienced cooks who knew exactly what cornmeal could do, and they stretched it across as many mouths as the supply allowed. Number 21, pinole. Among the Tejano and Mexican-born members of the Alamo garrison, pinole was as familiar as breathing. It was a flour made from parched corn ground fine, sometimes mixed with dried cacao, sugar, and cinnamon when those luxuries were available, but just as often plain. You could dissolve a handful in a cup of water and have a cold drink that delivered calories without requiring fire, without requiring a cook, and without requiring a bowl. Spanish missionaries had first learned the preparation from indigenous people, and by 1836 it had moved through centuries of Mexican frontier culture into the saddlebags of men who knew that the lightest food that kept you on your feet was the best. The Alamo had served as a Mexican military post as recently as 1835. Piñol was likely still in those storerooms when the Texian garrison moved in. Number 20. Hardtack. Some of the men who rode to the Alamo in early 1836 had served in campaigns before, and soldiers who had served in campaigns carried hardtack out of professional habit. These hard squares of flour and water, twice baked until they were closer to clay than bread, could survive months or years in a dry sack. They required soaking in liquid before a man with a full set of teeth could eat them without flinching, but they represented calories in a stable, portable form. And calories were what the men inside that compound needed more than anything else as February turned toward March, and the Mexican artillery kept opening the mission walls a little wider each morning. Number 19. Dried beans, frijoles. Pinto beans and black beans were the everyday protein of the Texas frontier in 1836, for Mexicans, Tejanos, and Anglo settlers alike. Dried beans packed in sacks kept for a year without spoiling and required nothing except water, heat, and time. Time was something the Alamo defenders still had during the early days of the siege, when Santa Anna was positioning his forces and the shooting had not yet become continuous. A clay pot of beans simmering over a low fire in one of the mission's interior rooms, seasoned with salt pork fat or dried chili, or simply salt, was the most practical hot meal the garrison could manage. Beans appeared at virtually every meal in frontier Texas. They would not have disappeared from the Alamo simply because an army surrounded it. Number 18. Dried chili peppers. The long strings of dried red chili peppers hanging from the rafters and kitchen walls of every Tejano household in San Antonio were not merely seasoning, dried chilies in 1836. Texas were a preservation technology, a medicine cabinet, and a flavor system all at once. Capsaicin in concentrated form was used by frontier surgeons to stimulate circulation and reduce shock in wounded men. Several defenders would be wounded before March 6th. And the chilies drying in the mission walls would have been applied to those wounds. In the cooking fire, dried chili crushed into bean pots cut through the monotony of siege rations and helped mask early spoilage in meat, held longer than it should have been. Number 17. Coffee. The Republic of Texas. In 1836, ran partly on coffee. Anglo settlers who crossed the Sabine River from Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee brought the coffee habit with them, and by the time of the siege, roasted coffee packed in cloth sacks was a standard provisioning item for any military force in Texas. During the siege, when the nights were cold and the watches were long, and the sound of the Mexican army moving in the dark kept men awake until the small hours, a tin cup of hot coffee was not a luxury. It was the thing that made standing another 4-hour watch in the February cold survivable. Number 16. Wild onions. San Antonio de Bexar sat in river-bottom landscape thick with wild onions in late winter. In the first days of the siege, before Santa Anna's lines tightened completely, small parties may have moved along the irrigation acequia near the compound and gathered whatever the ground offered. Wild onions were one of the most reliable early spring forage foods in central Texas. They added depth to bean pots and salt pork dishes, and they provided vitamin C that men on a diet of dried and preserved foods were not getting from any other source. Pattern break. Here is something that gets left out of every movie about the Alamo. The men inside that compound were not a unified military force living under standardized conditions. They were volunteers ranging from trained soldiers to frontier farmers to 32 men who rode in from Gonzales on March 1st, knowing exactly what they were riding into. The food inside the Alamo was not distributed by a commissary sergeant with a ledger. It was cooked by the Tejano women sheltering in the compound, women who had done this kind of cooking under pressure their entire lives. They worked with what was available. They stretched it. They made it last. That is what the movies skip past. Number 15. Lard. Every storeroom in a Texas frontier settlement in 1836 held lard. Rendered pig fat packed into clay crocks sealed with cloth. It kept for months in cool temperatures, and it was the cooking fat that made everything else possible. Corn dodgers fried in lard developed a golden crust that plain water corn cakes never achieved. Salt pork rendered its own fat, and that fat was collected and used to cook the next meal. For the women cooking over the Alamo's fires during those 13 days, lard was the medium through which raw ingredients became food. Number 14. Beef on the hoof. This is the one that surprises people. When Santa Anna arrived on February 23rd, there were live cattle inside the Alamo compound. Jim Bowie and the garrison's leadership had driven a small herd into the compound before the Mexican army closed the final avenues of approach. Primary source accounts, including the testimony of Susanna Dickinson, who survived the battle, mention cattle inside the walls. A live cow represented more than beef. It represented milk, and slaughter could be timed for when morale needed it most. Historians estimate the garrison butchered at least some of these animals during the siege, producing fresh beef that would have been roasted, boiled, or cut into strips and dried over the compound's fires. Number 13. Beef tallow. When the cattle were slaughtered, the fat was rendered immediately. In a compound where candles meant the difference between darkness and the ability to tend a wound after dark, tallow served two purposes at once. The cooking fire and the candle mold competed for the same resource, and the women managing the compound's domestic operations knew exactly how to divide it between them. Number 12. Corn tortillas. The Tejano women inside the Alamo compound had been making corn tortillas since childhood. The nixtamalization process that transformed dried corn into masa required only corn, water, and coal. Slaked lime available in a mission built partly from lime mortar. Tortillas required no oven, no bread raising time, and almost no fuel. A woman who knew what she was doing could produce a stack in 20 minutes, and those tortillas wrapping around beans or dried beef became a portable meal a man could carry through the compound without stopping. Number 11. Pozole. The simplified version of pozole that existed in frontier Texas in 1836 was nothing like the elaborate ceremonial dish it had been in pre-Columbian Mexico. By the time of the Texas Revolution, it had become a practical siege food, hominy corn simmered in whatever broth was available, thickened with its own starch until it sat heavy in the stomach. Hominy was a storeroom staple in Tejano households and in the missions that had been feeding soldiers for 100 years. Santa Anna's own soldiers carried it on the march north from the Rio Grande. The Mexican army surrounding the Alamo was itself eating pozole by campfire, close enough that the defenders could smell it on cold, clear nights. Number 10. Atole. When the Tejano children sheltering inside the Alamo compound needed feeding, and historical accounts confirm children were present during the siege, the women turned to atole, a warm drink made from masa flour dissolved in hot water. Sometimes sweetened with piloncillo, atole was the comfort food of Tejano family life in 1836. It required almost no ingredients beyond cornmeal and water. It went down easily for the sick and the very young, and it could be made in a clay pot over a fire small enough that the smoke would not draw fire from Mexican artillery positions less than 200 yards away. Pattern break. Here is what siege arithmetic looks like in practice. Historians studying the Alamo's provisions have estimated that the garrison held somewhere between 30 and 90 days of food at the time the siege began. The siege lasted 13 days. On pure caloric mathematics, the defenders did not run out of food before March 6th. What they ran out of was time, but the conditions of the siege meant that hot cooked food became progressively harder to produce as artillery fire intensified. By the final days, the food being eaten inside the Alamo was almost certainly the cold, no-cook kind. Dried beef, parched corn, tortillas made during quiet hours. The garrison was not starving when Santa Anna's troops came over the walls in the pre-dawn darkness of March 6th. They were hungry, exhausted, cold, and outnumbered 7 or 8 to 1. Those are different things. Number 9. Piloncillo sugar. Hard cones of unrefined brown sugar pressed from raw cane juice. Piloncillo was the sweetener of the Texas frontier in 1836. It dissolved slowly in hot water or coffee, releasing a flavor darker and more complex than refined white sugar. It kept indefinitely in dry storage. During 13 days of siege, in the moments between artillery barrages and the interminable waiting, A spoonful of piloncillo dissolved into a tin cup of hot coffee was one of the few small dignities available to the men and women inside those walls. Number 8. Root vegetables from the Mission Garden. The Mission Gardens attached to the Alamo had been productive in previous years, and late-season root vegetables left through the winter would still have been present in February of 1836. Whether the garrison systematically harvested them during the siege is not documented, but the resources were there, and the Tejano women managing the compound were not the kind of people who left food in the ground when mouths needed feeding. Number 7. Sotol hearts. The sotol plant, a desert shrub growing in the limestone hills around San Antonio, had been a food source for indigenous peoples of central Texas for thousands of years. The rosette heart, roasted in a pit for many hours, produced a starchy sweet food that could sustain a person for days. Whether any of the Alamo's defenders used it during the siege is uncertain, but the Tejano fighters who had lived their entire lives in this landscape knew exactly what it was. In a siege where every calorie mattered, a man who knew the land knew something the history books mostly did not bother to write down. Number 6. Venison jerky. Deer hunting in the river bottom around San Antonio was productive enough that dried venison was a common provisioning item for Texas frontier households in 1836. Several volunteers who rode to the Alamo in January and February came from settlements along the Colorado and Brazos rivers, men who had been hunting their own food since boyhood. Venison jerky, thin-sliced, salted, and dried in the winter sun, was portable and protein-dense and almost impossible to spoil. The men who arrived carrying their rifles likely arrived carrying jerky in their saddlebags. Once the siege began, what they had on their person was what they had. Number 5. Acorn meal. The live oaks growing in the river bottom around San Antonio dropped mast in autumn, and in 1836 there would have been dried acorns still available in the Mission compound's storage, carried in by Tejano families who processed them as a supplementary starch. Acorns required leaching to remove bitter tannins before the meat could be ground into usable flour. The resulting meal was dense and slightly sweet, mixed into cornmeal to stretch it further. Anglo settlers from Tennessee or Virginia would not have known this preparation, but the Tejano families inside the compound were fully fluent in the food resources of the landscape they had inhabited for generations. Number 4. Pecans. In February of 1836, the pecan trees along the San Antonio River were bare of their autumn nuts, but pecans dried and stored from the previous fall would have been present in the storerooms and in the personal provisions of families inside the compound. Tejano families gathered them by the bushel each autumn, as a matter of course. They required no cooking, no preparation, and no fire. A handful of dried pecans in a coat pocket was exactly the kind of portable, no-cook food that made sense inside a compound under artillery bombardment, when building a cooking fire in an exposed position meant drawing accurate fire from gun emplacements less than 200 yards away. Pattern break. There is a thing that happens in the telling of the Alamo story worth examining here. The 13 days of siege get compressed in popular memory into a single dramatic moment: the final assault, the flag, the names on the cenotaph. What gets lost is the texture of those days. Cold February mornings, hours of silence between artillery exchanges, children sleeping in the sacristy, women grinding corn and keeping fires small enough not to draw fire. Food is where that texture lives. The history of what people ate during a siege is not a footnote. It is the account of how human beings maintain small dignities when everything around them is aimed at their destruction. The people inside the Alamo did not stop eating. They did not stop cooking. They just ran out of March 6th. Number 3. Mescal and pulque. The maguey agave growing across the Texas Hill Country and the brush country south of San Antonio had been a food and beverage source for Central Texas populations for a very long time. Pulque, the mildly fermented sap of the maguey, was common in Tejano households in 1836, consumed more as a nutritional supplement than as a recreational drink, in the way fermented beverages had long served as safer alternatives to uncertain water. Mescal, distilled from roasted agave hearts, was present in San Antonio's cantinas and almost certainly in the personal possessions of some defenders. Number 2. Cow's milk. The cattle driven into the Alamo compound included at least some animals producing milk. Susanna Dickinson's account of the siege mentions the cattle specifically. A milking cow represented fresh protein and fat that no amount of dried provisions could replace. Milk could be drunk directly, cooked into corn porridge to enrich it, or allowed to clabber naturally in the cool February air, producing a thick, soured curd. For the children in the compound and the wounded men in the long barracks hospital room, that milk was the most valuable food inside the Alamo walls. Number 1. Water from the acequia. This is the one that wins. The acequia, the irrigation ditch running along the south wall of the Alamo compound, was the garrison's water supply throughout the siege, and Santa Anna knew it. One of his tactical objectives in the early days was to cut off that water channel. The garrison dug a well inside the compound as insurance, and historical accounts confirm the digging proceeded under artillery fire. Every food on this list required water to prepare. The corn could not be ground into mesa without it. The beans could not cook without it. The coffee, the pozole, the atole, none of it was possible without water flowing through that acequia. The garrison defended that water supply as fiercely as they defended the walls. Every morning for 13 days, someone walked to that channel with a clay jar or a tin bucket. And the fact that they still could was what made every other meal on this list possible. Here is the challenge. The next time someone tells you the Alamo story and starts with the guns and ends with the flag, ask them what those 200 people ate for breakfast on March 5th. Ask them what the children in the sacristy ate. Ask them who did the cooking. The answers are in the record if you know where to look. Leave a comment telling me which of these foods surprised you most. I want to know if you knew about the cattle, or if the acequia well changes the way you think about those final hours. Because this is not just the history of a battle. It is the history of people who kept cooking until they could not anymore, and that is a different kind of courage than the one carved into monuments.